In this class, we are going to look at the results of the Crusades that were fought over hundreds of years. Now, we had already seen why did the Christians go on the Crusades. One reason was the Christians wanted to free the Holy Land from the Muslims, and more so after the call of Pope Urban II. This was during the Third Crusade, wherein it became an official thing, wherein the church sanctioned it, it was supported by the church. And also, the church promised benefits like absolutions from sin and they'll go to heaven. Those kind of promises were given. So it became an official thing. So the Pope Urban II, he wanted to unite the Roman Catholic and also the Eastern Orthodox Christians, that is, people in the Byzantine Empire. And he wanted to regain the Holy Lands from Muslims, because if the onslaught of the Muslims were not stopped, then they would have easily run into the Western region, the Western Christendom. So, in order to stop that, he wanted to stop the Muslims from advancing further. And what about the other people who were involved in the Crusades? They also had some kind of benefits in mind. So the church wanted both the Christendoms, as in the Eastern as well as the Western, to come together and fight against this common enemy, that is Muslim, because they wanted the Holy Land, and that was the call given by the Pope. Whereas the merchants who were involved in this, they wanted to access trade routes. They wanted to discover new trade routes and they wanted to improve their business. So they also joined along with them. Whereas the knights in shining armor, all these brave warriors, they wanted to support the church. Also, many of them, they hoped to gain land and wealth. And please remember, most of these men were younger sons, because of the succession rules in England specified that the wealth and the title of a family would go to especially the main title of the family would go to the elder son, whereas the younger ones were left either with some money or nothing. So they were the ones who were free, and they also took up the call to crusade, because for them it gave them an opportunity to gain land and wealth. So with Pope Urban's call for crusade, you have the Holy War beginning. And this was mainly said to regain control of the Holy Land, because by 1095 or so, Islamic Empire had invaded and had taken the holy city of Jerusalem. So from the east, these people were advancing towards the west, especially with the coming of the Seljuk Turks. Before that, when the area was under the Arabs, there wasn't much problem, because the Arabs were quite tolerant. They were very well civilized, and they had no issues with Christians coming and worshipping in Jerusalem or staying there. So it was not much of a problem. But with the advent of the Seljuk Turks, things started changing, and there was a lot of hostility between Christians and Muslims. And with the call of Pope Urban the Second, you have even the church actively participating in this holy war. So over the next couple of years, hundreds of years, 300 years or so, we have Christians fighting Muslim armies in 9 different crusades. Please remember, so total there were around 9 crusades that were fought. Uh, and the thrust of most of our lectures has been the first 3 crusades, the major ones. So now, during the first crusade, Christian soldiers, they took back Jerusalem. Whereas during the second and the third crusades, Muslims, they took back Jerusalem and they kept it under their power. And after the third crusade, there were many other crusades. As I had mentioned before, children's crusade, then you had the traders, merchants crusades, like that. You had a series of crusades, but then Christians, they could never regain the Holy Lands. So the Holy Lands were gone out of their hands. So it was only during the first crusade that they could take control of Jerusalem. Now, what were some of the effects of the Crusades? The Crusades brought cultural diffusion, as in a coming together, an intermingling, mixing of different cultures of the West and the East were brought together. And this introduced new ideas into Western Europe, because till then Europe was totally cut off from the East and they had absolutely no idea what was happening on the other side of the globe. So now with the Crusades, they came in touch with this Eastern civilization, which was much more advanced than theirs. This also increased this desire for luxury goods like silk, cotton, sugar, spices. Right. So earlier they did not have access to all these things. So the whole lifestyle started changing, and the moneyed lot, the aristocracy, the nobles, they started leading a very luxurious life, and these things were luxuries, silk and cotton. So all these things came from the east. Egyptian cotton, for instance, is the best in the world. Then you have spices from far eastern regions, like even countries like India. And it also introduced technologies like compass. Then astrolabe is that ancient device used to measure distances of heavenly bodies, right? Astrolabe. Then ship designs, gunpowder, they did not have all these things. So this contact with the East brought these people in touch with these kind of stuff. It also introduced ideas like Arabic numbers. Zero has its origin in India, right? So these things were given to them. Then chemistry, algebra, telescope, all these things were new to the Western world. Now, what were some of the long term effects? One is that it increased the trade between Europe and Middle East. Earlier, there was hardly any trade as such between the East and the West. But with Crusades, the route was open, wherein they could trade across countries and continents. The second long term effect was the Italians. They could act as middlemen in the trade between Western Europe and the Middle East. So Italy became wealthy, and it is this wealth that led to what you call the Renaissance or the reawakening. Now, this is Italy, right? The shoe shaped country. So, Italy was the port of call, or the port in between. The east and the west, right in the middle. So this was something, Italy became something like a middleman or middling country, because they had to stop here and then go further. Even if they were traveling from west towards east, this was the major port. So Italy became really wealthy, and many families, for instance the Medici family, who uh, contributed quite a lot of wealth towards establishment of institutions, learning, research. All that was made possible because of this wealth that was generated due to the trade between the east and the west. What about the impact on the common people? So, when you look at the common people and the Crusades, we can safely say that the common people, they were not at all bothered about the ideals for which the Crusades were fought. So, they did not really care about the church or salvation or freeing the Holy Land from the hands of the Muslims. Because it did not affect them in their daily life. So, they were not really bothered about that. And another thing was, they really disliked this excessive taxation which was imposed on them to finance the holy war, because the money was uh, generated from the people. If you remember, during the time of Richard the Lionheart, if you remember, there were different taxes imposed on them, right? So they were unhappy about that. So on the whole, holy war for them meant more expenses, more worry. And what about people, common people, bonded laborers, and the younger sons? For them, it was an opportunity to improve their lot in life, to better their lot. So they saw this as an opportunity. So they would join these people, the aristocrats and nobles, going on this holy war. They would join them, they would go with them, and then they would explore new lands. They would try and um, increase their wealth, get into trading, or they would explore new lands. So they would go with them. So they saw this as an opportunity to make some wealth. So it brought them a lot of social and economic benefits. Social benefit, as in the bonded laborers, now they were like, once they went on the crusades, they became free. So they became free men, so they could go explore the world, they could settle in other parts of the world, and they could own vast stretches of property, which would not have been possible if they had stayed back in England or France, or one of the regions in West. All their life, even for their next generations, would have continued as bonded laborers. But then this gave them an opportunity to get out of that vicious circle. And also it gave them this thrill of adventure, going into a new land, because they did not know what the next day would bring them, right? So this thrill of adventure was quite attractive to many of them. And again, talking about the far reaching effects of the Crusades, we can see this continuous contact with the East. For 200 years or so, there was this constant touch between East and the West, which led to the development of trade and commerce. And the ablest men of the half developed West, we'd already seen that West was not as developed as the East. So the most ablest from the West, they were brought in touch with the trade, arts, science, and knowledge of the East, which had a more developed civilization. So it was like a win-win situation for, in a way, the ablest and the learned lot. They could learn quite a lot from each other. Especially the West, they gained more because they were not as developed or advanced. And a city like Venice, it became Europe's window to the east, and it became the chief trading city of the west. So you had fleets of ships from Venice carrying luxurious goods to the west. So you had stuff like velvet and muslin from Mosul, damask from Damascus, oranges and dates from Arabia, spices from India. All these things were made possible because of the Crusades. Again, Venice began to be known as the Queen of the Adriatic and a center of wealth and sea power. We had already seen how the whole country of Italy had become wealthy, and these crusades made it possible for adventurers like Marco Polo to travel across the heart of Asia right up to the hidden land of China. So the land routes and the sea routes were now open. People knew that if they took a fleet of ship towards a particular direction, where they would lead. So this helped many adventurers like Marco Polo. And I've put an excerpt from this text by G.M. Trevelyan, A Shortened History of England, wherein it is said, the rich, many-colored fabric of later medieval life, the world of Dante and Chaucer, would never have come into existence if barbarous Europe had remained as much shut in upon herself as she had been before the Crusades. So when you talk about these beautiful stories of Dante, Chaucer, these things, the colorful world of Chaucer would not have been possible without the Crusades, because many of the things would have been missing in the Western civilization if it had not come in touch with the Eastern civilization. And this led to the birth of curiosity. This contact with the East made them more curious and instilled in them a sense of adventure. And this prompted many European men, especially English seamen, to travel far and wide in search of new lands and new worlds, which led to further discoveries. So the first stone of the empire upon which the sun never set was laid back in the 11th century. So later in when you go to the 16th century or so, you have the beginnings of the British Empire, right? The British colonial power, the rise of the British colonial power. All that was possible because of the Renaissance, because till then their world was limited to France, France, England, and the neighboring countries. But now with the Crusades, The whole world was their playground. So you could safely say that the search for God, it had led them to gold and glory. And when you look at another effect of the crusade was this transition from feudalism to nation states. We had already seen how the western country was highly hierarchical and feudal in nature. So now this started changing. They saw how other countries were governed in the east. They had these concept of nation states. So you have a slowly democratization process happening in many of these western countries. So now these crusades were financed by the financial and governmental institutions, right? And then governments and the church began to tax the subjects, and this was not acceptable to many people. There were kind of dissent. People spoke against it. So this feudalism, which was highly oppressive, started changing. You have otherwise also, when you look at the political organization of the west, slowly things were changing, and the crusades were like a catalyst which changed these areas, these places, from following the oppressive feudal system into a more democratic nation, parliamentarian kind of governments. And this crusades also helped in repairing the old Roman roads for faster travel. You might remember when we did this chapter on Roman civilization, how they had built wonderful roads, wherein they were so good that we even have a saying that all roads lead to Rome, right? So all those roads which had fallen out of use after the going away of the Romans and after the fall of the Roman Empire, now they were all repaired and kind of reclaimed for the purpose of this continuous travel. And again, we had already seen how it increased the trade across the Mediterranean. The standard of living in Europe increased because of the trade. They were able to procure more goods, more luxurious goods, as a result of which the standard of living improved. And the Western people, they benefited from new ideas learned from the Arabs. So now, if you have to summarize the whole thing, you can say the Christians, they lost the Crusades because they did not get the Holy Land, but then they gained a lot of wealth, they gained a lot of knowledge, and their whole entire way of looking at life changed because of these Crusades. So now, what happened by the 1300s or so? Much of the old Byzantine Empire became the Muslim Ottoman Empire under the Seljuk Turks. So the Byzantine Empire came to an end, and you have the beginning of the Ottoman Empire. Now, this Ottoman Empire, it lasted until the early 1900s, and even after that, Islam continued to spread even further. So again, repetition, it increased the trade with the East. Another thing was the use of money instead of bartering. Earlier, bartering was quite popular, wherein you exchange one thing for another, exchange of stuff and property. So instead of bartering, they started using money. Then there was this new ideas and technology from the Muslim nations brought back into Europe.